Welcome to Wise Guys.
Today's topic, Trump's Syrian intervention.
Today we're going to be talking about an article from the National Interest, which I would say is a realist foreign policy publication.
Yeah.
Specifically, the article is interesting. It's entitled Trump's Syria Folly is Bad for Everyone. And the first thing I want to talk about, the very first sentence is, Trump is turning into Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, and I've seen a lot of accusations of this in the past few days. A lot of people who were, I think, a core part of the Trump base, Trumpsters, as we call them here at Wise Guys. The argument is that President Trump came in very specifically against unnecessary or risky interventions in the Middle East, and where they focus on America first, unlike most other politicians that he was running against in the general and in the primaries.
Right, and I would say you have to make a cutout, because he did say he wanted to go after ISIS aggressively.
He did. That's true.
Now this is starting to go into Assad, which is the Syrian regime. I mean, it's not exactly the same thing; they're related. But he didn't necessarily say he was going to pull back everywhere, right?
No, that's absolutely true. But it's funny that Wes mentions ISIS because in the article, one specific thing that said is candidate Trump also promised the American people that he would focus on the Islamic State, which is promoting terrorism around the world, including in the United States. Now, he seems ready to target the strongest military force opposing the Islamic State and other radical forces. Now, as Wes just mentioned, the airstrikes that Trump recently had on a Syrian military base were against President Bashar al-Assad's regime and its use of chemical weapons against its own people. Interestingly enough, while ISIS is related to Syria, the relation is that the Assad military forces have actually been helping to fight against ISIS. So after the airstrikes, there were a lot of claims of ISIS couldn't have wanted anything better. There's no better way to help ISIS than to effectively hurt the Syrian authoritarian regime.
Right. I mean, you can see it in Saudi Arabia. You can see it in Egypt. You see it also in Syria. You have authoritarian governments that are fighting, even more radical movements.
Right.
And that's pretty common in the region. The key difference here, though, is that Syria is an ally of Russia.
Yes, it
is. Not our ally.
Well, it's an ally of Russia and Iran, who both came out right after the U.S. strike, and the Iranian Russian governments announced, we will respond strongly to any aggression on Syria.
Right.
Trump definitely went in knowing that he was picking a fight with a nuclear-powered, not necessarily an ally by any means, not necessarily an enemy either.
They're a great power.
Absolutely, Russia is a great power. And Iran, on the other hand, who after the nuclear deal, things were looking a little bit different. But I would say this is enhanced aggression, if nothing else.
Right, and the response actually was that the Russians decided to move down some destroyers off of Syria, the Syrian coast, to be able to provide, I think, some cover in case of future U.S. strikes. Not to say that they would do it, but basically to deter.
Right.
To being able to say, hey, United States, we have the capability to shoot down missiles or to protect the Syrians from further strikes. Don't escalate.
And I mean, it was a defensive move, of course, because at the point where a Russian or Syrian military equipment or air missile or anything like that actually attacks a U.S. force, I'd say that President Trump goes all in,
I don't think neither side wants that. And
exactly.
I would say this is actually a series of defensive moves, because Syria is using these chemical weapons as a last resort, regime survival.
Right.
Whether you agree with that or not, obviously it's a horrendous decision to make, but it is a defensive decision. They're using it in their own territory, fighting against people that are trying to overthrow their government. I don't think that government has a lot of moral authority, but that's what they're doing.
No, it doesn't.
And the Russian response was also defensive. Our action, I would say, by launching the missiles was defending the international norm.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's defensive necessarily.
I mean, the argument really is, and this article says it pretty explicitly, even before President Trump's latest flip-flop, it was clear the president has, at best, a superficial understanding of international affairs. Apparently, he had not noticed after years of war and hundreds of thousands of deaths that Bashar al-Assad was an unpleasant character. But one photo of the dead from a chemical attack, and Trump swung into action. Now, not only must Assad go, but Iran and Russia must stop supporting Damascus. I think that's a pretty brutal way of identifying this change here. Though there are sources from inside the White House that effectively said it was after looking at the pictures of the children and the women dying from these chemical attacks that President Trump felt America had a moral authority to do so. Nikki Haley, President Trump's ambassador to the United Nations, has now also said that it's time that now, she specified now, Iran, Russia, and other regimes must answer for supporting Damascus. So clearly something changed, right?
I mean, I think what you would look for is now going into the future is less likely that Assad stays in power. I mean, Assad's Alawite minority and his family or somebody connected to him might still be who's in charge in Damascus once this all settles out. But I think with the United States having tipped the balance here, I'm not sure if Assad is going to last. I mean, I think in the end, in any type of deal that comes out in the end, I think you would even probably see Russia pressuring him to go to the next, stepping down.
I mean, I think you have a really good point, but I also think that one thing we've learned from President Trump, both candidate Trump and President Trump, is that it all depends on how the next 2 or 3 weeks go. It's really possible this was it in terms of his decision on really moving into Syria, and he wanted to make this symbol, because ultimately the airstrikes were that. They were symbolic more than damaging. They didn't really do any great deal of impact.
The Syrian Air Force probably only has so many airframes and facilities. So for the Syrians, it's not going to affect the Russians so much, but
right.
It affect the
Syrians. And Syrians are still using that same airstrip to take off just a few hours later, hastily.
Yeah, but this would be more for saying stop using chemical weapons.
Absolutely, right.
That's really the norm.
So if Assad stays away from that, maybe President Trump pulls back. We don't know. I do think, though, and the article makes some really interesting points here on what the impact of this is with Russia and China as well, which isn't something that's discussed as much explicitly.
Right here. One of the worst consequences of the Obama administration's tough stance towards Russia was to push it and China together, which is terrible for the United States.
Yeah, and unfortunately true. I mean, there's a lot in this article that you might agree or disagree with, but it's definitely it's accurate that China is looking towards other great powers that feel wronged by the United States and don't want U.S. decision-making and judgments to rule every corner of the globe. That defines the Russian-Chinese relationship, right?
Right. And they're right next to each other. They're in each other's backyards. They're actually natural adversaries.
They should be adversaries. Right. And so they're uneasy friends, if anything, right?
And we don't want to push them more together. And, Trump initially came. This is actually it's funny if you look back under many U.S. presidential administrations, when they come in and when they're campaigning, they actually tend to be a little friendlier towards Russia, and then towards the end, they start to be really negative towards Russia. So you see that pattern with Trump. You saw that pattern with Obama. At first, it was reset.
Yeah, it was reset.
Cold War's over.
Right.
Then it was the Cold War's back. And it was like that with Bush. At first, it was I looked into his eyes, I saw his soul, and it ended in the Georgian invasion.
Right. So, I mean, also to be fair, like Crimea happened on Obama. The last few recent presidents have been like, let's give Putin a chance. And then like, well, he's invading, so
right. He's taking territory.
Right. Exactly.
So this has actually been. Maybe this is something the Russians themselves do.
Right.
Maybe this is a strategy that they take to try to get more political space in the beginning of an administration.
Some leeway to do what they need to do.
Because we know that there's back channel talks going on.
Absolutely,
even
but
with campaigns.
And we can obviously in campaigns there is, but we can remember. I mean, Doug Bandow, author of this article, goes ahead and further points out Russia can also assist or impede efforts to denuclearize Iran and North Korea, confront the Taliban in Afghanistan, battle terrorism elsewhere, and counterbalance China. They're in pretty much all major national security focuses the United States has had in the recent past and recent history. And I'd say China is one of the really interesting ones because our decision making with Russia and how we antagonize them, or at least the aggression between the United States and Russia, will ultimately lead to a stronger friendship between Russia and China, or another player who doesn't want to see the full rise of China. And that's interesting. If the United States has Russia and India both simultaneously working, and Russia and India work together pretty well too. So if they've got Russia and India working together on different facets, including potentially stopping or counterbalancing China, that's a pro for a lot of our national security issues.
That'd be huge for us, but we haven't shown an inability to really get there.
Not yet. And I mean, especially when
over multiple administrations.
Exactly.
Yeah,
This is not on President Trump alone. This has been
Or Obama,
for
or Bush.
quite some time, and the Islamic State only makes it more confusing because
It's a mess.
you can actively point out that Bashar al-Assad is an unpleasant character, is a guy that's doing bad things. We want to remove him from power.
But he's in the anti-ISIS coalition.
But also, here he is fighting this force that
Right.
we're terrified of, right? And one that President Trump really explicitly said, we're going to eliminate them off the
Right.
face of the planet. That was very clear.
One interesting thing about this piece that Mr. Bandow wrote is, he kind of trumps up Russia's role and says that they would be good to work with, even though they're authoritarian.
Right.
And yet, at the same time, I thought it was funny. He's knocking us for being friends with Saudi Arabia as a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
And it's like, ah.
I mean, I think at this point he's drawing the line between a great power and not, just solely that you kind of have to deal with the consequences of being friendly with a great power, or you're gonna have some form of Cold War. Alternatively, there's no need to keep giving Saudi Arabia all these air refueling and all this different things for them to attack Yemen. But that goes a lot further than that too, right? I don't think the peace does any justice to the Saudi Arabian Yemeni conflict. It's not as simple as Saudi Arabia is attacking the poor Yemeni.
Right, yeah, that's definitely not that simple.
Nothing in the Middle East is, which is what makes the Syria airstrikes and the quote-unquote intervention or potential for it even more confusing.
It's basically a Shia thing, so both Yemen and Iran, supposedly.
So, I mean
we
history
thought
goes back a while.
Yeah, we thought this was a very interesting article. It touches on a lot of stuff. I mean, because really, it's funny how ISIS and Syria, obviously, but then how that's intertwined. But then that brings in us in Iraq,
Right.
and Russia,
Right.
and then how that really plays out with China, which is not even really in the region. Right now.
No, not at all. And I mean,
how interrelated.
and that's how China is really, strategically playing their cards, right? They get to just watch the United States kind of bumble around in this region and pretty much make mistake after mistake, or do a good thing that's seen as a mistake later, whatever it is, take decisions, and decisions have good and bad consequences, while China gets to just watch and kind of bide their time, while never helping us on the United Nations Security Council.
Right.
So it's an interesting one, and we thought this article was a good way to wrap a lot of those things in. We'll have the link for you in the description. You should give it a full read if you get the chance. As always, thanks for watching. We're the Wise Guys, and we'd appreciate your questions, comments, and concerns via Twitter or email.